The call came in just after sunrise, a disjointed, panicked voice barely stringing words together. "My boyfriend, he's cold. The kitchen. There's blood." Dispatch flagged it immediately, sending units to the address at White Barn Way. The house was tucked in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place you'd expect kids on bikes and manicured lawns. Not a gruesome scene. When I arrived, the first responder was already stepping back from the door. Melissa Turner stood in the entryway, barefoot, blood smeared on her arms and shirt. She waved us in, her voice shaking, but composed enough to be unnerving. "He's out back. I tried CPR, but he's gone." She didn't wait for us to follow. Instead, she turned abruptly, leading us through the house. The smell of copper hit me first. It was faint, a trace lingering in the still air, but it was enough to raise the hairs on my neck. Then I saw the trail. A dark red line stretched from the kitchen, leading past the open window and into the backyard. Melissa's voice trembled as she talked, but I wasn't focused on her words. The scene spoke louder than anything she could say. The kitchen was a battlefield. Blood spattered across the white cabinets, streaked on the counters. Broken glass littered the floor, mingling with droplets of red. A switchblade lay near the sink, its blade stained. A larger knife sat abandoned on the counter, dull against the morning light, but unmistakably smeared with what could only be blood. Something had started here. Something violent. The struggle was evident in the disarray. A toppled chair, a shattered glass jar, items scattered as though thrown in a frenzy. I followed the blood trail to the open window, noting the smudges along the sill. Outside, near the pool, the body of Matthew Trussler lay face up. His shirt was soaked through, crimson spreading across his chest and pooling beneath him. His arms were outstretched, his right forearm bearing a deep gash, a defensive wound. His chest bore a jagged laceration, but the most telling injury was the stab wound to his back, partially obscured by the folds of his shirt. He looked young, mid-20s maybe, the kind of guy who should have been worrying about his weekend plans, not meeting his end in a pool of his own blood. His smartwatch still clung to his wrist, its screen cracked but active. It was a grim thought, but I knew that tiny device might tell us more than Melissa would. As paramedics approached, I turned back to the house. Melissa was standing near the kitchen island, arms wrapped around herself. "I don't understand," she muttered, almost to herself. I woke up, and he was just there. I studied her. She was pale, trembling, but the blood on her clothes wasn't just streaked, it was smeared, the kind of smudges you'd expect from prolonged contact. Her hands bore small cuts, superficial but fresh. I noticed the faint tremor in her left hand as she brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. Trauma? Maybe. But something about her composure felt off. My partner joined me, handing over a pair of gloves. "You see the knives?" he murmured. I nodded. 2 of them, and a switchblade. He gestured toward the counter, where the handle of the second knife jutted out, clean of any visible blood, a contrast to the first blade. "One's clean, one's not," he added. Melissa's voice cut through our quiet exchange. "He was drinking last night," she said, her words faster now. "We had some wine, played cards. I don't know what happened after. I fell asleep in the office chair downstairs. I didn't hear anything." Her words begged questions. No noise? No commotion loud enough to wake her in the same house? I glanced at my partner. His expression mirrored my own skepticism. Why on earth would anyone want to murder their wife? She shook her head. "There's no reason." We walked through the house again, piecing together the path of the struggle. It started in the kitchen, a violent eruption of chaos. But how had it moved outside? I replayed Melissa's words in my mind. I didn't see him at first. Not until he was already gone. Already dead. The medical examiner arrived shortly after, confirming what we suspected. Time of death, somewhere between 4 and 5 a.m. Matthew had bled out. Defensive wounds on his arms and the stab wound in his back painted a clear picture. He hadn't gone quietly. Before leaving, I spotted something Melissa hadn't mentioned. A small camera mounted high in the corner of the hallway. Its tiny lens reflected the morning light. A quick call to tech support confirmed my hunch. It was motion activated. We'd know soon enough what it had seen. Melissa was brought in for questioning as the team continued their sweep. Every inch of that house held clues. Clues we'd use to piece together the truth and to form a puzzle. And standing there, staring at the blood-stained kitchen, I couldn't shake the feeling that Melissa Turner knew exactly what had happened. Melissa Turner sat across from me in the sterile, windowless room. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting an unflattering hue on her pale, blood-smeared face. Her hands fidgeted in her lap, occasionally brushing against the bandage now wrapped around a small cut on her palm. She was composed, but it felt practiced, like she was holding something back, struggling to find the balance between grief and innocence. "Melissa," I began, leaning forward slightly, "I know this is a difficult time, but we need to piece together what happened last night. Let's start simple. Can you walk us through the day?" She nodded, her eyes darting briefly to the recorder on the table. "Yesterday started normal," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I woke up around 4:30 a.m. for work. I'm a cam model. I worked for a few hours while Matt was still sleeping. After that, we walked our dog together like we always do." She paused, taking a breath, her hands tightening in her lap. "We went to Home Depot. We were planning some renovations, you know. Then we stopped at Publix for groceries. Matt cooked dinner. He liked doing that. Afterward, we played cards, had a few drinks. It was just a normal night." Her story flowed effortlessly, almost rehearsed. But I had learned over the years that the truth often lies in the cracks. And after that, I pressed. "After the drinks, I was tired. I went to bed around 10:30, maybe closer to 11. I slept on the chair in the downstairs office." She hesitated, her brow furrowing. "Matt? He stayed up. He drank more. He always drank too much. That was one of our fights sometimes. His drinking." "Fights." I latched onto the word. "Did you two argue last night?" "No," she said quickly, shaking her head. "We were fine. We were having fun. Like I said, I just went to bed." I nodded, feigning understanding, then shifted my approach. "Melissa, when you woke up this morning, what did you see?" Her face crumpled slightly, and she took a shaky breath. "I woke up late, around 8:30, which is unusual for me. The kitchen, it was a mess. I thought maybe Matt had fallen or something. He was outside by the pool. He wasn't moving and he was cold. I called 911 right away." Her voice cracked, and a tear slid down her cheek. It was a good performance. Almost too good. I kept my tone calm but firm. "Melissa, was there any point last night when things got out of hand? An argument, perhaps? Maybe Matt got angry after drinking?" Cora remembered Kay. She froze for a moment, then shook her head again. "No, I told you, we didn't argue, we were fine." "Melissa," I said gently but firmly, "there's something you need to understand. The evidence we've collected doesn't align with what you're telling us. Matthew didn't die by accident. He was attacked and he fought back. This was violent. Whoever did this, it wasn't quick." Her face paled further and her voice wavered. "I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't do anything to him. He was like that when I found him." The door opened briefly and my partner stepped in, placing a folder on the table. He gave me a curt nod before leaving. I opened it, pulling out a few photos. The bloodied knives, the shattered glass, the blood trail leading outside. "Melissa, we found 2 knives. One was clean, the other wasn't." "Why would there be a clean knife at a scene like this?" "I don't know," she said, her voice rising slightly. "Maybe he grabbed it. I don't know, maybe he grabbed it. I wasn't there." "And the argument?" I pressed. "Neighbors reported hearing yelling around 4 a.m., a man and a woman. Was that you and Matt?" "No," she said quickly, but her voice cracked. I don't remember. Maybe he was yelling at something else. He'd talk to himself when he was drunk sometimes." I leaned back, letting the silence stretch. The weight of the evidence was pressing down on her, and I could see her composure starting to crack. "Melissa," I said finally, my voice low and deliberate, "we also found Matthew's smartwatch. It recorded his heart rate up until 4:31 a.m. That's when he died. And the security camera footage we recovered from your home, it shows movement in the house leading up to that time." Her eyes widened, panic flashing across her face. She opened her mouth to speak but stopped herself. I pressed on. "Melissa, we know there was an argument. We know Matthew was attacked. We're not here to judge you. We just need the truth. If this was self-defense, now's the time to tell us." Her hands trembled as she clenched them together. Tears welled in her eyes, but she bit her lip, as though trying to keep herself from speaking. The room felt suffocatingly silent. Finally, she whispered, I tried to take the knife from him. He was drunk and he got mad. I didn't mean to." I scooted away from her, pretending I wasn't listening. Her voice trailed off, her confession incomplete. But I didn't push further. I knew the next steps would involve piecing together the truth from her fragmented story and the evidence we already had. I stood, gathering the folder. "Melissa, we're going to take a break. But I need you to think about this carefully. The truth will come out. It always does." The crime scene told a story far removed from Melissa's claims. Every detail spoke of a violent struggle, one that began inside the house and spilled into the backyard, where Matthew's life ended. The blood trail began in the kitchen, splattered on the counters and smeared on the floor, leading through an open window to where his body was found by the pool. The broken glass, the overturned furniture, and the bloody knives scattered across the kitchen told us this was no accident. In my line of work, I've learned that evidence doesn't lie, people do. Back at the scene, the medical examiner was documenting Matthew's injuries. Defensive wounds marred his right forearm, a deep laceration crossed his chest, and a stab wound penetrated his back. The brutality of the attack left no doubt. This was personal. Whoever killed Matthew knew him well. The neighbors' reports confirmed our suspicions. A surveillance camera from a nearby house had picked up an argument around 4 p.m. The audio was faint but clear enough to distinguish a male and female voice shouting. We collected the footage, knowing it would be crucial in painting a timeline. Inside the house, we found Matthew's smartwatch still on his wrist. The data from the device was damning. His heart rate spiked, then flatlined at 4:31 a.m. That timestamp, combined with the camera footage, aligned with when the argument escalated into something fatal. The kitchen knives presented another clue. One was covered in blood, while another remained mysteriously clean. Forensics would later reveal whose fingerprints adorned the handles. Still, the inconsistencies in Melissa's story, coupled with the physical evidence, made her the primary suspect. But there was more. In the living room, we recovered footage from a motion-activated security camera. At 3:39 a.m., Melissa was seen running into the office, her movements frantic. Minutes later, at 3:42 a.m., Matthew passed the camera on his way to the kitchen, Melissa trailing behind him with a look that could only be described as pure fury. At 4:09 a.m., she appeared again, this time near the front door, muttering to herself. A few minutes later, at 4:15, she was seen unloading materials into a truck. A faint red hue on her right hand, possibly blood, hinted at what had just occurred. By 8:35 a.m., the camera captured her wandering the house, her disheveled appearance in stark contrast to the polished version sitting across from me in the interrogation room. All of these pieces began to form a picture, but it was Melissa's behavior during questioning that raised even more alarms. Her initial calmness, the rehearsed way she spoke about their day, and her insistence that she had slept through the night, didn't match the evidence. When pressed about the argument at 4 a.m., her story shifted. Suddenly she remembered Matthew waking her up, drunk, and an argument ensued. Then came the claim of self-defense, that Matthew had grabbed a knife and she had wrestled it away from him. She had been shot by her boyfriend Peter and killed by her husband Jack. Then the three fell to the floor. Melissa's injuries didn't corroborate her story. A small cut on her hand, allegedly from grabbing a broken glass, was inconsistent with the level of violence we were seeing in the crime scene photos. If she had been in a fight for her life, There should have been more. A lot more. Defensive wounds, bruises, anything to suggest she had been overpowered. Instead, the injuries on Matthew's body told a much different story. The analysis of the knives and glass shards revealed smudged fingerprints, indicating attempts to clean them. Bloodstains on the kitchen counter and walls suggested that Matthew had been attacked there, struggling to escape. The open window leading to the backyard showed signs of a hurried exit. His last act of survival ended tragically by the pool. The surveillance footage was the tipping point. While the audio caught the shouting match, the visuals painted a clearer picture. The sight of Melissa pacing, muttering, and returning to the kitchen was damning. The timestamps aligned too perfectly with the smartwatch data for this to be coincidence. By the time Melissa broke down in the interrogation room, it was no longer a matter of if she had done it, but why. Was it premeditated? Had the argument escalated into an uncontrollable rage? Or was there something even darker lurking beneath the surface of their seemingly ordinary life? The clock was ticking. Every new piece of evidence brought us closer to the truth, but it also raised more questions. For now, one thing was certain. Matthew Tressler hadn't simply died. He'd fought for his life, and someone had taken it from him in a moment of pure, unrelenting violence. Melissa Turner's behavior under scrutiny became the focal point of our investigation. As we pieced together evidence, her shifting narratives and erratic demeanor left us questioning the depths of her involvement. The interrogation, once a conversation, was now a battle of wits, and she was losing ground. Surveillance footage revealed Melissa in the early hours, pacing the house, her disheveled appearance stark against the sterile crime scene photos. Her muttering, caught faintly on the security camera, hinted at a deeper unraveling. The timestamp of 4:33 a.m., when she was heard uttering "so effing die," coincided with the smartwatch's final heart rate recording. It was chilling. Evidence doesn't scream guilt, but it whispers it clearly. Melissa's interviews were riddled with inconsistencies. She claimed to have no memory of the early morning altercation, but later described grabbing a knife from Matthew during an argument. Her insistence on his violent tendencies seemed like an afterthought, a crafted narrative meant to deflect blame. "I swear he was drunk," she pleaded. "He got angry. He grabbed the knife." The small cut on her hand was presented as proof of self-defense, but it didn't align with the brutal scene in the kitchen. Blood patterns suggested that Matthew had been attacked relentlessly. Defensive wounds on his arms painted a picture of desperation, of a man trying to shield himself from fatal strikes. Melissa's claims of self-defense began to crumble when we presented her with the crime scene timeline. The struggle started in the kitchen, with broken glass and scattered knives marking the chaos. Blood trailed from the room to the open window leading to the backyard. Matthew had used his last moments to flee, an act of survival, not aggression. The fatal wound to his back made her claims almost laughable, if the reality weren't so grim. "What about the surveillance footage?" we asked her. "You were seen trailing him into the kitchen. His smartwatch places his death at 4:31 a.m., yet you called us over 4 hours later. What were you doing during that time?" Her response was another attempt to spin the narrative. She claimed to have blacked out, her memory hazy from the confrontation. She said she woke up disoriented, only to find him outside, lifeless. But her actions during that time spoke volumes. Her movements in the footage, her calm demeanor when she dialed 911, and the methodical cleanup efforts suggested she was more calculating than confused. Forensics added another layer of damning evidence. The knives, one of which was identified as the murder weapon, bore only Matthew's blood. If she had wrestled it away from him as she claimed, why weren't her prints more evident? Why wasn't her blood found on the handle? Instead, her fingerprints were discovered on a wiped section of the kitchen counter, as though she had tried to erase her involvement. Melissa's desperate attempts to frame herself as the victim unraveled further when we revisited her timeline. Neighbors confirmed that the couple had frequent arguments, with some describing Melissa as volatile and manipulative. Matthew's family painted a picture of a man who had been isolated from his loved ones, his demeanor shifting in the months leading up to his death. The final blow came with the discovery of the home's motion-activated camera. The clips were damning: Melissa running towards the office, Matthew heading to the kitchen, and the tense interactions between them moments before his death. The footage contradicted her initial claims of a peaceful night followed by an unexplainable tragedy. Instead, it showed tension boiling over into something deadly. Despite her attempts to portray Matthew as the aggressor, the physical evidence and witness testimonies made it clear who held the knife that night. As we moved closer to finalizing our case, it became evident that Melissa's story was an elaborate web of lies designed to shield her from accountability. Her panic during the interrogation wasn't just about the crime. It was the realization that the walls were closing in. Her desperation was palpable as she shifted from calm denial to frantic pleading. She began to grasp the weight of what she'd done and the inevitability of justice catching up with her. By the time we secured her confession, it wasn't out of guilt or remorse, but fear. Melissa Turner wasn't the victim she claimed to be. She was a killer who underestimated how much the truth could scream through the evidence she tried to conceal. And in the end, it would speak louder than any of her lies. The head of programs checked her email. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Melissa Turner sat motionless at the defendant's table, her face a mask of stoic resolve. After weeks of meticulous testimony, damning evidence, and heart-wrenching victim statements, the jury was finally ready to deliver their verdict. As the foreman stood, the air seemed to thin, every breath in the room held in silent anticipation. Guilty of second-degree murder. The words echoed through the chamber, heavy with finality. Melissa's composure cracked momentarily. A single tear traced down her cheek, though it was impossible to tell if it was regret or fear. Her defense team exchanged resigned glances. There was no surprise in the room. The evidence had been overwhelming. Matthew Trussler's family gripped one another, their shared grief a stark contrast to Melissa's isolation. His mother's face was etched with a bittersweet mix of relief and sorrow. Justice had been served, but nothing could bring her son back. The courtroom's quiet murmurs rose to a hum as the gavel signaled the end of the trial. Yet for those most affected, this was far from the end. At Melissa's sentencing, Matthew's mother delivered a victim impact statement that gripped the room. "I don't believe your greatest crime is killing Matthew," she began, her voice trembling but resolute. "It's what you've done to his memory. You tried to smear his name, to make him into something he was not. You took a life, but you also tried to steal his dignity." Her words cut deep, laying bare the pain of a family who had lost not only their loved one, but also the truth of who he was. Matthew's sister followed, recalling memories of her brother's kindness and love, painting a picture of the man who had been taken too soon. Melissa's turn to speak came next. Her voice broke as she addressed the court, maintaining her innocence even as she expressed love for the man she had been convicted of killing. "I didn't want this to happen," she said through sobs. "Matthew was my world. I didn't mean to hurt him. I've lost him too, and I will carry that weight for the rest of my life." Her words hung in the air, but they did little to sway the judge. The sentence was handed down, 20.5 years in prison. As Melissa was led from the courtroom, her shoulders slumped under the burden of her fate, the clang of her chains echoing in the silence. In the days following the verdict, the Trussler family struggled to find a sense of normalcy. The house where Matthew had lived and died remained vacant, a stark reminder of the life and dreams that had been cut short. Neighbors whispered about the tragedy, their quiet suburban street forever marked by the horror of that night. Forensic experts and psychologists dissected the case in the media, painting a chilling portrait of Melissa Turner. The narrative of a woman whose life spiraled out of control, culminating in a fit of violence, captivated the public. Online, opinions were polarized. Some painted Melissa as a victim of circumstance, while others condemned her as a cold-blooded killer. But for Matthew's family, there was no debate, no solace in the noise. Their son, brother, and friend was gone. They visited his grave often, leaving flowers and mementos that spoke of a love that could never fade. His mother vowed to keep his memory alive, ensuring the world remembered the real Matthew. Melissa Turner's case served as a grim reminder of the complexities of domestic disputes and the devastating toll of unchecked anger. Advocacy groups used the trial to spotlight the importance of recognizing red flags in relationships, urging individuals to seek help before tensions erupted into violence. In prison, Melissa adjusted to a life of routine and reflection. Behind bars, she continued to maintain that she had acted in self-defense, though her ever-changing stories had long since lost their credibility. She kept to herself, her once glamorous world of horror-themed cosplay and online fame reduced to the gray monotony of prison walls. Forensic evidence, surveillance footage, and digital records had stripped away the veneer of her lies, exposing the brutal truth. But the impact of that truth would reverberate far beyond the courtroom, touching the lives of everyone connected to the case. The story of Matthew Trussler and Melissa Turner was one of love turned toxic, of dreams shattered by violence, and of justice hard-won in the face of lies. It was a cautionary tale of the thin line between passion and destruction, and of the enduring pain left in the wake of a single, irreversible act. For those left behind, healing would be a slow and uncertain journey. But they clung to one truth. Though Matthew was gone, his memory remained, untainted by the shadows Melissa had tried to cast over it. And in that, perhaps, they found a sliver of peace.